Thanks for being here, and thanks to Jane for joining me for this celebration of Phil Whalen's, the publication of Phil Whalen's journals. Bowed some, chanted a little. And thanks to the Zen Center for being willing to sponsor us to do this. Both Jane and I were friends with Philip, and both of us are mentioned in the journal because we were living with Philip at Tassajara when he was there. So I'm not. Let's see. I'm not sure who's there, but I bet there's lots of people there who have stories about Philip, and we want to leave plenty of time. We have a whole hour and a half. We have till 3:30 if we go that long, and so I want to be sure that we leave time for those of you who have stories to tell them, because I think Jane and I are not going to tell stories. I think we're going to read from Philip's journals a little bit and maybe a poem or two of Philip's. And I'll start that process, and then I'll turn it over to Jane. And when Jane's done, we're going to open the floor to any of you who have something to say. Either those of you who are friends of Philip, and I'm looking at screen number one, and there's a bunch of you who I know knew Philip, or just who know his writing and want to say something. So that's the plan. So I'm going to start by saying that the editor, this is all about Philip Whalen. We're celebrating Philip Whalen, but I also want to celebrate Brian Unger, because Brian Unger worked for about 10 years, going back and forth from New Jersey, where he was living, to California, where Philip's notebooks and journals are housed in the Bancroft Library. Brian spent about a decade putting this together. And it was a tremendous labor of love because, as some of you know, Brian was also a student at Zen Center and a really good friend of Philip's. So he did this not out of sort of a distant like literary interest, but a literary interest as well as a personal interest. So I want to read you the end of Brian's acknowledgments, where he says, I must also thank Zenshin Ryufu Philip Whalen himself. I had completed 5 years of formal literary studies by the time I first studied with him at the San Francisco Zen Center, and yet at the time I had a very untested and inchoate ideas about 20th century American poetry. Although I had lived in New Jersey, New York, and Philadelphia, I poorly understood the work of Ginsberg, Baraka, and so on. At that time, I don't even think I had even read or studied Williams. And as a young Zen student trying to comprehend this monk poet, Philip Whalen, I had no idea or plan whatsoever that one day in the future I would take up this work of editing and arranging his literary journals. As his biographer, David Schneider, has said, and a shout out also to David, who wrote a terrific biography of Phil called Crowded by Beauty. I think that's the right title, right, Jane? Crowded by Beauty. As David has said, to be around Philip Whalen for any length of time was to notice deep wells of being and subtle teaching. The rich intimacy of these journals speaks volumes in these decades since his parinirvana. So this phrase, anybody who was around Philip for any length of time, was to notice deep wells of being and subtle teaching, and also a very quirky, troublesome, and interesting fellow to be around. Really, really funny and wonderful person. And he's very important to me in particular. He was one of my most important teachers and my literary mentor. And at our Everyday Zen organization, every year on his birthday, we do a ceremony where I speak to him and read a poem of his on October 20th every year. And he just celebrated his 100th birthday. This was his 100th birthday, 2023. So now I'm going to read some selections from his journals. And I'm selecting on purpose, because this is a Zen Center event, I'm selecting stuff about Zen Center and his time at Zen Center. There's lots of other stuff in here, lots of literary stuff, but this that I'm going to read is mostly has to do with Zen Center. So this is from June 22nd, 1975. He's at Naropa, trying to have a short informal visit with Trungpa was a great deal like trying to have Dokusan with Roshi. There's a lot of stuff in here about his time with Richard Baker Roshi. I was scared, shy, nervous, inadequate to the occasion. Although I didn't faint, fart, or vomit, I giggled and tried to appear respectful and ingratiating. Alas, I had no calm, no solidity. Here I was in the principal's office, a school kid trying to explain his misconduct, but expecting a beating, or a high school kid from the country having his first interview at an office in the city. I still feel some obstacle that stands in the way of my relationship with Dick, and Dick is Richard Baker. I suspect that I am standing in my way, myself or ego or fake imagination. Now, a month later, 24 July, same year, 75. Is Maximus Volume 3, so this is when Maximus Volume 3 is published, is Maximus Volume 3 the last of Charlie O? Like the other books, it is a mixture of gold and gurry, his word, equivalent to Allison Gass's grunge. Gloucester and Dogtown are completely boring, even when he's pointing out their splendid historical and geological glories. But he can tell us what snow or the moon or a star-nosed mole made him feel, since his feelings were unique and exact, and his language about them was relatively clear. We get moons and snows and moles, unlike others that have appeared in poetry. 25th of the same month, next day. It seems to be settled that I shall be Shusou in September. It is being made very clear that I shall be there at Tassajara in a purely ceremonial capacity. The board of directors have selected people for the Rokuchiji. The Roshi and the Rokuchiji will present me with a Benji of their choosing. 29th August to 5th of September. 7-day session at Green Gulch Farm. Reb's hellfire and brimstone number before lunch, the 6th day, was ridiculous, but it terrified all of us. I'm going to come around and hurt you if you go to sleep. I will punish you. I expected to leave the Zendo through pools of blood and fragments of bodies, but he didn't hit a single person, and I know of 2 at least who were sound asleep. Sunday, the 14th of September, 75. First day of Tangaryo. Katagiri Roshi lectured on the silence of the universe, Buddha's world. Quote, close your mouth, keep your mouth shut and practice. At the end of this training period, you may feel good or you may feel bad. It doesn't matter. Please continue to do Zazen, Katagiri said. 23rd of September, 75. Obit. Clarence Leslie Thompson, at age 50, a good friend of Philip's from earlier times before he came to Zen Center. I guess he was about a year younger than I am. Shirley phoned today to talk with me and to have me send something to be read at the private graveside service that will be held at Montesano on Saturday, September 27th. Roshi offered to provide $, and transport, etc., 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 if I wanted to go to Seattle and Montesano, but I simply can't leave here at this time. The practice period needs every bit of energy and attention that I can give it. In some way, the period is dedicated to Leslie's memory and to all my teachers and families. 28th of September, 75. I underwent the Shusou ceremony, Hosen Shiki, strenuous debate with the Sangha and its officials all afternoon. Clear, cold, and windy now, after a day of drizzle and chill. And this is December 7th, 75. Tassajara. No place to go, nothing to do. Tomorrow, John drives the white truck to Salinas to get parts to fix the green truck, pick up the laundry. 500 pounds of sunflower seeds. December 13th, 75. Return to 340 Page Street, party at Paula Anglin Gallery for Joanne's new book, All This Every Day, which is dedicated, quote, to Philip Whalen. I love the full stop. So now I feel that I have eternal fame and my life is a success. And like Leslie said in his last letter, I am content. Now I'm skipping ahead to 1977, and I think this is the time when both Jane and I think, were there at Tassajara with Philip. And this is 15th of October during the fall practice period of 1977. Saturday, 98 degrees Fahrenheit in the 90s for several days, 80s before, etc. The great storm is to come tomorrow or the next day. The, in caps, Governor of California has arrived, accompanied by Jacques and Connie Borgazzi and their son, Vajra, Linda Ronstadt, and others. Hiding out from reporters? The Forest Service crew, which has been here for the past week or so, is burning piles of brush in the creek bed, filling the already intolerably hot atmosphere with choking fumes and vapors destructive to eyes and nose. They are a weedy, rowdy lot, ages 19 to 25, many with, quote, spare tires and pot bellies from too much college beer and junk food. Certainly they consume prodigious quantities of milk, meat, and the rich desserts which Gail Scher manufactures especially for them. And Gail Scher, many of you know, she was also there with us. In fact, we were roommates. Kathy and myself and our twin sons were roommates with Gail Scher at that time. And she went on to become a poet too. October 17th, 77, Monday. The governor attended service and breakfast in the Zendo. It gave me the feeling that what we are doing here must be, quote, real in some sense, must be effective in some universe somewhere. Because his legs can't or won't fold, he looked lonesome and uncomfortable, perched on a high zafu. They brought him some bowls on a tray to eat from. I suppose it does him some good to get into something as simple and elegant as our kind of eating ritual. All we had was hot mush, yogurt, sliced figs and bananas, and garnish of gamashio and wheat germ, but all of it was served with the usual pomp and flourish and chanting. The great monk, Tenshin Zenki, and a lesser one are scheduled to appear here on Thursday. And Thursday comes. The Zentatsu Roshi is supposed to reappear soon, along with some kind of uptown monk from the Eiheiji. Kaz Tanahashi will travel with the great monk. The great monk has recently been installed as Tanto at Page Street, Hoshinji. It might be better to name him the monk exemplary. He has the appearance and makes all the sounds appropriate to the model monk, in capitals, model monk. He wants very much to be so, just as the Lama Govinda, who Philip most of the time referred to as Lamar or Govinda. Here it says Lama, but he usually called him Lamar. Wants so very much to be a Lama, as one of the more elegant of our Tibetan teachers has remarked. We are distorted and ruined by our desire, no matter how noble their object. Saturday, 22nd of October, 77. A front page story and photograph in the San Francisco Chronicle about Zentatsu Roshi being Governor Brown's Zen connection, and how the appointments of Gary, which is Gary Snyder, Huey Johnson, Sim van der Rijn et alia, to state offices was due to the influence of the ambience of Zen Center and the soirees at the Roshi's house next door. In early morning zazen, the Roshi said, "Let your gigantic body sit." I think it is arranged now for me to leave Tassajara on Thursday morning, January 12th, early with Alan Block, who's over there on the screen, with Alan Block, who drives his own van. The Jambo Marlowe Axis will come too. And a few of you will know what that is, the Jambo Marlowe Axis. Jambo is what he always called Mike Jamvold. And he was married to Wendy Matlow at the time, or almost married. Didn't last too long, but Tassajara, 10:30 a.m., Monday, January 16, 78. Lots of rain. The creeks grow higher, and maybe new little brooks appear in the grounds, running off the small, steep hills above the hill cabins and down the main driveway. The Chusseau, Isan T. Dorsey, has taken to his bed in order to prevent the arrival of any serious illness. January 22nd, 78, sick, capital, sick. The aching, dizzy head, the broken bones and rheumatic joints. Tommy brought me a bag of cookies. That's Tommy Dorsey, Isan. Tommy brought me a bag of cookies, which I devoured. Chocolate chip, a Vienna crescent, and some nondescript cake cookie wedge. And Norman brang a piece of peppermint with half an orange. Now the evening service is being chanted and thumped, and in a while, Keith will bring me the gruel and the vegetables. 23rd January 78, Jiyu Ho Raku, bliss of enlightenment, which the Buddha himself enjoys. Saturday, November 1779. In the middle of the second period of evening zazen, Roshi came in to announce that Chris Pirsig had been murdered earlier this evening. Chris was the son of the famous Robert Pirsig, who wrote Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Chris was a student at Zen Center and was murdered near the Zen Center, right around the corner from the Zen Center on Page Street. A little later, he delivered a short eulogy, ordered an extra half hour of zazen, and ordered the bell to be rung 108 times. I think everybody participated in the bell ringing. Chris was to have been ordained as a priest in January. Oh, I forgot to tell you that anybody who wants to have closed captioning or turn off closed captioning, there's a chat about that. I'm supposed to tell you that at the beginning, and I forgot. Wednesday, 21st of November, 79. John Bales, who's also, I think, over there somewhere, right? Yeah, John is there. Kotatsu. John Bales gave me a long rap yesterday. John will remember this, and he'll be able to tell us later whether this is accurate or not. John Bales gave me a long rap yesterday about how the boss is Baker Roshi, about how the boss isn't spending his time writing fundraising letters addressed to the very rich, capital V, capital R. JB was introduced to Paul Mellon and played Scrabble with him and presented the Zen Center proposal book. PM, Paul Mellon, very nice man, per usual. Very smart, Yale, who did graduate work in English at Cambridge and can quote all the old Irish guys. I said, in Gaelic? John answered, I don't know. I suspect that these are the same old Irish guys who interest William Irwin Thompson and Kathleen Raine. Mrs. PM, a Mary, some Irish name, very rich, from St. Louis Vassar, an old Vassar chum of, in caps, Nancy Wilson Ross, who was a very important friend of Richard Baker's and a friend of the Zen Centers, a very wealthy New York lady who is connected to many other wealthy New York people. Thanks to them, we got funding for Tassajara and stuff like that. Mary McGinty Mellon, allergic to horses. So this is PM's wife. Mary McGinty Mellon, allergic to horses. Mr. PM has passion for riding to the hounds through classy Virginia landscapes. Mary M. tries to overcome horse allergy, asthma, etc. Consults Carl Jung and all the old Irish guys about it. This is the genesis, he says, of the Bollingen Foundation. Is that how you say it? Bollingen or Bollingen? I don't know. Bollingen? Yeah, anyway. Who was the first organizing president manager of the Bollingen Foundation? Stanley Preston Young, another important donator to the Zen Center and the coterie of sort of rich American Buddhist funders. One terrible day, PM and wife go a-riding through expensive Virginia landscape. Mary M. develops attack of asthma, goes home, but chokes to death before her physician arrives. JB, John Bales, suggests that later on, a Freudian, in caps, a Freudian nerve doctor was able to explain to PM that PM wasn't guilty of causing Mrs. M's death. Bollingen Foundation had finished, or shortly had finished publishing its projected series of 108 books. Anyway, it naturally ended. And the last thing I'll read from this is one short paragraph, which when I read this before the book came out, I thought this was absolutely the best definition of monastic life that I had ever read. It totally captures monastic life. Here it is. It's a short paragraph. Saturday, February 16th, 1980. A monastic life is a strange mixture of high idealism, paltry intrigue, and contagious delusionary systems. I think that's exactly right. Anybody who's ever lived in a monastery will recognize that. A monastic life is a strange mixture of high idealism, paltry intrigue, and contagious delusionary systems. Health food, a fatuous complacency, and boredom perhaps lead to paranoid empire building within the organization. Low-grade mysteries and shabby melodrama recur with appalling frequency. People regularly suffer from a variety of nervous disorders, not to say outright madness, and the number of obviously disturbed individuals who come to examine us or to apply for admission is very great compared with the number of ordinary folks. So you see how entertaining that is. And it goes on that way the whole way through, all almost 400 pages out. And I just want to refer to this book because this is another labor of love. Philip inspired tremendous love, and there were people who just were devoted to him. And Brian was one of them, and that's why Brian spent 10 years on that. And another one was Michael Rothenberg, who is now passed on, who spent an equally long length of time putting together this collected poems of Philip Whalen. And I think really everybody should have this book, The Collected Poems of Philip Whalen. It's got a lifetime of work in it, just as I'm well aware, Jane's got a book just about out, right? Just out and available now, which also contains almost a lifetime of work. I think it's officially a new and selected, right? But it's really got 50 years of work in it, right? But you have to say the title because I've forgotten. I'm sorry.
I have to unmute. There we go. So I don't have it I have the galleys. I don't have it's out. This is what the cover looks like, except it's a big, handsome, hefty hardback, and it's called The Asking. And thank you, Norman, for that lovely pitch for my.
But it's true though that a book like this and like that one, these are books that a person should have because you don't read this kind of books you read and then you give them away, but you don't read a book like this or like that and give it away. You have it all the time and you go back to it and you read it again and again. And so, because it's a person's entire life, right? So you have to have that. So I'm going to just read you just one or two little short snippets. Now, he's got some poems that are very, very um, cogent and moving, but his poems, first, I forgot. First, I have to read you this because this is Brian. Brian is explaining why Phillips' poetry is so important, and you might not get this unless you understand. So here's what Brian says. Whalen is highly regarded by contemporary scholars and poets for the idiosyncratic poetics he developed. His poetry is very idiosyncratic. When you first read it, you say, "What is he? What is this? This isn't poetry." It's very idiosyncratic. He developed through a complex project of Buddhist phenomenology, East Asian poetry as introduced by Ezra Pound and Ernest Fenollosa, a deconstruction of language and space influenced by Gertrude Stein and William Carlos Williams, and a lifetime devotion to the 18th century British satirists Jonathan Swift, Lawrence Sterne, and Samuel Johnson, among others. So all of that really is behind Phillips' work. Many of Whalen's poems read like refracted moments of Zen meditation, the ancient and somewhat peculiar form of Buddhist contemplation practiced intensively by the Soto Zen school, whose North American iteration Whalen was trained and ordained in. He eventually became abbot of a Soto temple. And then he's quoting here Leslie Scalapino, who was also a dear friend of Phillips and of mine, who we've also lost, brilliant writer who loved Philip and wrote about his poetry. She said, Whalen's poetry is phenomenological rather than visionary. It is not about something. Rather, the writing is the mind's operations per se. To her, his poetry is based not on images, but rather on sound schemes, frequently the leaps and omissions of conversational exchange whose space and processes are active mind phenomena, the mind creating self, the inside and outside together. In other words, Brian adds, refracted moments of Zazen meditation. So you need to kind of appreciate that to get Zen Phillips' poems. And I'm going to quote some poems that emphasize that aspect of him. So this, and I've just sort of chosen these almost at random. And I'll try to, there's all kinds of drawings in the middle of poems and caps and, graphics. This poem is called Sunday Afternoon Dinner, Feng Loi Restaurant, San Francisco, 25/9/62. Bus, wagon, 7 o'clock trip to the kitchen, and then a long line. On time, caps. On the other side of the page, ink, caps, ink. By the pocketful. Ink in jars, tubes, blocks, and dishes, never or seldom where it belongs. Down below, more ink displaced. Cuttlefish in sepia sauce. Chop suey, eggs for young, pork noodles, fortunate cookies, fly shrimp, bosatsu pudding. When the smoke of the cooking flies away, all that's left we consume what may. A very Chinese interest. Plastic. Do I bore you? Coriander leaves. Apart from which, as precious unguents, herbal wines, and essential oils sweat and ooze, collect a powder of gone spiders. Portentously Sunday food, smoke, as if we were gods and cherubic presences. The Saturday visitations. 1. Belligerence, mixed bathing, and that was the end of the Roman Empire, which ought to have lasted at least 3 weeks longer. Question mark? Oh, yes. 19 people, cars, a great big highway patrolman, on purpose in cars. 2, all people, they love they try to tell us we may sue, exclamation point, very tiring. Forget it. And I'll read you one or two short Tassajara poems that are much more tame and normal. Garden Cottage 1, which is a place many of us will remember. Philip lived there many times during practice periods. Garden Cottage 1. Chill morning moonlight garden by Douanier Rousseau. Some weird bird or animal cries at 3 a.m., lost, meaningless, wild. Temporarily, the moon window in the sleeping loft composes a picture of mountains and treetops in the Chinese taste, although an edge of the roof cuts a cord out of the circle. If I should die, the picture would decompose, the window just be a hole in a wall. The mountains would be someplace else. This is probably all about a poem I wrote 16 years ago. And I'll stop with this because I'm going on too long, I'm sorry. Back to normalcy. And this is written in Tassajara in 77. My ear stretches out across limitless space and time to meet the fly's feet coming to walk on it. The cat opens an eye and shuts it. That much meaning, use, or significance. Wind chime, hawk's cry, pounding metal generator, bell and board rehearsing blue jays. Dana, some of you will know Dana Dantine, who was probably the Tenzo at the time. Dana, phoning, shouts, "You mean fiberglass?" Telephone, grape leaves shake together, dull blonde sycamore sunshine. Dana says, "All you guys bliss out behind the carrot and raisin salad?" Brown, dumb leaves fall on bright ferns, new and thick since the fire. We had had a giant fire the summer before that practice period. Thank you, everybody, for listening to all that, and I hope you enjoyed Philip's words. He's something, everything that came from him was so lively, always lively and alive. And speaking of lively and alive, here is the fantastic Jane Hirschfield, who I'm very grateful was willing to share this event with me, an old friend of Philip's too. So Jane, you'll read and talk, and then when you're done, we'll hear from others. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Norman, for that fantastic selection. So beautifully embodied the voice of our dear friend. So when I first arrived at Zen Center, Baker Roshi pointed to two people who he thought I would be very interested in. And now I was 21 years old, and somehow I had, with the hubris of the very young, arrived at Zen Center telling everybody I was a poet. And so Richard Baker decided that I should know that there was a fantastic pianist and composer, Lou Richmond, and a real poet, Philip Whalen. And so both of them were pointed out to me sort of as a way of saying, there's room for someone like you here. It was amazing to be there with Philip, who was such an extraordinary person and mind. I was there so I met him at Page Street, and then we overlapped. I think he left in the middle, but I was there with him in 75. I was there with him in 77, 78. Norman, I forget which year you and Kathy were there. But that whole era that Norman is reading from was the era that we overlapped. I thought I would give you, now many of you who are listening were also there at that time. And one of the things that I remember both most strongly and alas, with least detail, is the literary lectures that he would give us. And I thought I would start before reading from the excerpts from the journals. I just made a little list, skimming through really fast. These are where Philip's mind would go, not including any of the Japanese or Chinese or Buddhist references. Winnie the Pooh, Heraclitus and Empedocles, Hart Crane and Oedipus, H.P. Lovecraft, the Palatine Anthology, Yeats, Sacco and Vanzetti, Karamazov, Vermeer, Hans Bethe, the Beatles, Pythagoras and Plato, Blake, Proust, Finnegan's Wake, and the atomic testing grounds in Nevada. And that sort of shows you his mind was encyclopedic and omnipresent. He seemed to inhabit every part of world culture. I also found it amusing as I was reading through this amazing book to track the names by which he calls Richard Baker. So he calls him Richard Baker, he calls him Dick, he calls him, and this is sort of sequential over time. One of my favorites, for a while, he's fast-talking Buddha, then he's the boss, and then at the end, during the transmission period and after, he goes back to being Roshi. So the range of this book is so extraordinary. So I avoided, because Norman told me which time period he would be reading from, I avoided excerpting from that time period. And we don't have the earliest notebooks. Philip burned them in 1964. And so this is one of the earliest entries that we do have. And it's a little bit of his process as a writer. It's from the 24th of August, 1958. It is now more than a year since I first began this, and observe with a mixture of chagrin and a fine false indifference that I have managed to fill in not quite 1.5 of its 6 gatherings of pages. I would like to conclude that composing a page of nonsense every day from now on until the book were filled is a fool's errand. Nevertheless, I remember hoping that I would accomplish something of the sort, not necessarily nonsensical, when I began. I write this in bed at 3:40 a.m. after a day of reading, almost continuous rereading Tristram Shandy, during which I kept promising myself, I will stop at the end of this chapter and try to begin writing again. I didn't actually stop until a few minutes ago. I got into this pickle by starting a couple weeks ago with the notion that I must mend my prose style by perusing again the sedate pages of Johnson, the ironic epithets of Smollett, and the lively grace of Sterne. All that has resulted in an echoing of their sounds in my empty skull and bent reflections of their kinds of phraseology in current letters to my friends, and in this place, a dismal conclusion to my original plan. I have made no poem for several weeks. This is from 1965, the 7th of April. Is knowledge the real point? What about the way it manifests itself? How do we treat ourselves and others? Perhaps style is the really important thing. When I look up from writing this, I'm sitting astride a log on the beach in a fast southwest wind. I see rainbows ahead. That was said as a poem. Now we're back to prose. And the bases of style are compassion and wisdom. The acts themselves, being at once selfless and completely responsible, have only neutral consequences. But all this would only work if there were such a thing as I, action, another, etc. It was a beautiful solitary walk. Tulips a total delight, hidden cherry trees to stand under and look up at small rain. Falling blossoms in Japanese garden, a few early rhododendrons, and particularly the small Japanese varieties which are colored like nasturtiums. It has sprinkled rain all day. How it blows and rains, but not violently. A young girl in a fit of pique. Tomorrow, Lou and Duncan and I will all lecture and hold a colloquium on Gertrude Stein. Still 1965. And this is something that shows another side of Philip. It shows him and Gary and others protesting the Vietnam War. So the 28th of June, 1965. On June 22nd, I went with Gary to the Oakland Army Terminal. We sat outside the fence beside the highway, doing zazen from 7:20 in the morning until 4 in the evening. There were 25-minute periods and 10-minute breaks and an hour for lunch. No formal Keen Hin. Richard Baker, Jim Thurber, Robert Gove, Silas Hoadley, a man called Chalk Ryder sat with us, and in the afternoon, a man called Max joined us. Although many people photographed us and a few newsmen came around, none of us gave our names. Snyder had thought it best for all of us to remain anonymous Buddhists. While we sat, some of the people who drove past on the street behind us or on the street in front of us inside the terminal laughed or yelled insults or jokes. No one seemed to know what it was we were doing except for the police and military authorities who had been informed in advance. Now we're up to 1974, the 19th of February. One of the things which runs through this book is a sort of steady concern for a whole lot of Philip's life about how he was supposed to make a living, how he was supposed to get by. He had no family funding, he had nothing. And so he was often living hand to mouth and giving the amounts of honorarium that various college reading invitations were offering him and how much of a difference that would make. So just this tiny little short thing. Here I sit, 5:10 a.m., 50 years old, trying to figure out how I might make a steady income once I get tired enough of the Zen training. I ought to be able to do anything, but I've always done anything already. Roshi says, wait, don't make great catastrophical changes. 1974, the 31st of March. Freezing cold opening day for sesshin. I slept through most of the morning periods. It helped a lot to have 5 minutes extra of fast-moving Keen Hin just before the third period early this morning. Roshi inveighed against the idea of achievement and accomplishment. Surviving the sesshin is not the idea. The self should die. Try to forget who you were by the end of the sesshin. He changed the schedule to 2:30 wake-up in order to confuse and disturb and disorient us. A couple days later, same sesshin. I decided that I wanted to be in the Zendo, sitting uncomfortably on my chair if it meant enlightenment and the release, or even temporary relief from suffering for all creatures in all worlds. Then I considered the people in the Zendo, many of them suffering a lot of pain because of previously injured legs and bodies. Everything melted and collapsed inside my chest. I felt like bursting into tears, but didn't, since I've already cried about all that. I wondered how I might talk more directly and more clearly with Roshi, and discovered that I could do so only through the understanding of pain. This next one, so obviously, I think all of you will recognize all the names, but, Alan G. obviously is Ginsberg, Gary is Snyder, Lou Welch. And I picked this one just because it shows how completely embedded in the community of literature and how present Philip was for so many of its central friendships and relationships and events. So this comes from the 24th of May, 1974, written at Kit Kadizzi, the Ring of Bone Zendo, of course, Gary Snyder's place up in Northern California, Sierra Foothills, it says. 2-day celebration in honor of Louis's total disappearance at Kit Kadizzi. Gary invited all the poets, young and old. We chanted sutras on Bald Mountain. Alan G. formally declared Lou Welch empty, and Gary that Lou had become the local poet ghost of the region. This morning we met in the central room of Gary's house and chanted sutras. Gary read Lou's poem about Ring of Bone and declared that the Zendo will now be called Ring of Bone Zendo for men, women, and children to sit in. I caught a ride back to town with Peter and Joanne and Arthur Okamura. Leaping to 1985, the 14th of January, and these are notes that Philip made during the time that he was studying with Baker Roshi to receive transmission, which he spent a lot of time earlier in the book positing that he would never, ever be given. Why was everybody else given transmission and not him? And one of the things which is so moving about reading these journals is how unvarnished they are. The vulnerability, the presence of suffering and ego and ambition for enlightenment, I suppose. But anyhow, these are notes from his studies. Don't think of Shakyamuni Buddha as having been enlightened, i.e., don't think there's some powerful person out there who will take care of everything, enlighten everybody. A main element here, how to free yourself from teachings, from teacher, from father figure, without breaking the relationship. If you are enlightened, you will see that all persons are enlightened, whether they are aware of it or not. Enlightenment must be manifested, whether by one or several or many people, as long as it is manifested in the world. Enlightenment, all at ease with the way things are. Second main point, mountains, rivers, forms, people, all are standing in the eye of Buddha, and the eye has become you people. Buddha's eye has become everybody's whole body. Third point, see this story closely and be able to explain it, letting the explanation flow from your own heart, not borrowing the words of another. Own experience plus understanding of Soto and Rinzai ways should be poured down the riverbed of this lineage, this tradition. Leaping to Tuesday, December 6th, 1988, written at Crestone, the place in Colorado that Richard Baker moved to after having departed San Francisco Zen Center. Early tea at 3:55 a.m. I'm invited to drink matcha with the Roshi in a few minutes. Dehydration, stiffness from my fall day before yesterday. Now the wake-up bell. Weaknesses come and go, a few hallucinations. Dread Dokusan. How to lecture. Use own poems for texts. Lectures should have the kinds of leaps in them as in poems. Stop being intellectual. Address chakras. Develop hara. Move and speak from hara. Develop Kundalini practices. 1989, the 10th of July. At 5:45 a.m., it is hot in my room. I go now to sit and then must finish packing and then fly away with Isan to Santa Fe for Isan's grand ceremony. Yesterday, we had an all-day sitting. My knees are completely wrecked. I suppose that the airplane will finish them. Well, I'm always happy to read of other people's struggles all the way through. Struggles never end. This next is a small poem in the journals written during the Dharma transmission process. 29th of July, 1987. I've untied the rope. The boat will go where the river takes it. Out to the ocean, onto a sandbar, I sit back and watch unconcerned, marvelous. Years of Zazen calloused my ass. I still get along better with cats than with people. Nothing learned or understood, nothing changed. A narrow escape for the world. And the final journal section I will give you before I also read a few more poems. This is from what I think was Philip's final lecture when he was the abbot of the Hartford Street Zendo, having succeeded Isan in that position. 1996. Life and death. That's what it's really all about. We live in the midst of dying and die in the midst of living. We go through our lives picking up all kinds of things and calling it me. We become very fond of this creation, life and inanimate matter all glued together. I live at Hartford Street Zen Center. There is a hospice here for folks living with AIDS. Everyone is perishing slowly. I can understand a little bit what they are going through, that the end is not far away, because I am not well myself. Guys who are there and terribly ill are alive and know what is happening, that it's the end of the moving. If you stop moving, you are dead. It's very real when we watch friends fade and perish. Very difficult because we want to keep things as they are. But unless you experience your own death, you are lost. Really get close to it. What we are actually doing is dying all the time. Dying is an action. Ask, who is living? Who is dying? And when you go to the Zendo, ask, why am I here? Myo asked me this morning, what is the answer to it all? And I said, love. In one of our secret esoteric Zen circles, at the bottom of the whole shebang is Buddha's compassion to save all beings, a passionate drive to end the suffering of stars, fish, people, and everything. So, a few poems. Picking up on this theme that was in the journal earlier, a poem from 1955, written in Seattle. If you're so smart, why ain't you rich? I need everything else, anything else, desperately. But I have nothing, shall have nothing but this, immediate, inescapable, and invaluable. No one can afford this, being made here and now. This, I think, might be Philip's most famous poem, and many of us have, I believe, somewhere the broadside of his calligraphed writing down of it. Hymnus ad Patrem Sinensis. I praise those ancient Chinamen who left me a few words, usually a pointless joke or a silly question, a line of poetry drunkenly scrawled on the margin of a quick splashed picture, bug, leaf, caricature of teacher, on paper held together now by little more than ink and their own strength brushed momentarily over it. Their world and several others since gone to hell in a handbasket, they knew it, cheered as it whizzed by, and conked out among the busted spring rain cherry blossom wine jars, happy to have saved us all. So I'm going to want to stop in a couple of minutes, so we'll have time for other things. This poem, again, an early one from 1966, the Dharma Youth League. I went to visit several thousand gold Buddhas. They sat there all through the war. They didn't appear just now because I happened to be in town. Sat there 600 years. Failures. Does Buddha fail? Do I? Someday, I guess I'll never learn. And a one-line poem from 1978, The Inspection of the Mind in June. All of me that there is makes a shadow. Okay, when we finish, I've got one more poem that I'll read you to close our visiting so that we leave with Philip's words. But now Norman will welcome reminiscences, stories from the community, and I guess he'll tell you how to raise your hand and be called on. While you're figuring out how to raise your hand, I will just say that a story that happened before I arrived at Tassajara, but I was told about during my own Tangaryo, was that when Philip sat Tangaryo, he pulled out from the sleeve of his robes salt and pepper for those who preferred that to the offered gamashio, and passed it down the row of his fellow Tangaryo sitters, and I believe did the same with sweets later in the evening. Okay.